Thank you for having me here today. This is my first time in Moscow and Russia, so I'm still learning a great deal about the Russian ecosystem and the Russian situation here. I come from Silicon Valley. Is my English okay for most of you? Yeah. Okay. And actually, if any of you want to ask questions during my talk, I'm okay with that. It's more interesting, I think, if we have a dialogue, exchange, instead of traditional professor-student kind of thing. At Stanford, we prefer more open discussions instead of professors always just lecturing students. A few questions. How many of you have a Facebook profile? Okay, almost everybody. LinkedIn profile? So not so many on LinkedIn. I recommend everybody start to use LinkedIn as well. It's important. Twitter? Good. Okay. And which of you are students, current students here at the higher school? So a few, and the rest of you are recent students, so former students, professors, not quite professors, self-employed or entrepreneurs? Okay, great. And is this okay? So, and Mr. Cameraman, is this coming through clearly?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. So I'm going to give you a talk today that I gave earlier this week at a startup conference called 42 Conference at Digital October. And we're going to talk mostly about technology trends in Silicon Valley in the ICT information technology sector. But we're also going to talk about some of my impressions, recommendations for Russia, opportunities for Russia, and things you need to be careful about when you're cooperating with European institutions. And I'll tell you why I'm going to talk about this in particular. So this is essentially a long-term history of Silicon Valley, going back to the early days. Actually, Silicon Valley officially didn't really start until about here, late 1950s, 1960. Up until this period, it was just another region of the United States. There really were only one or two major companies. Hewlett-Packard was established in this period, and really from here up until here was the major Silicon Valley company, mostly around defense electronics. So this early phase, this is all about electronics, early days in electronics and defense electronics. And then with the discovery of the integrated circuit, of the transistor, then you begin to see a new generation of companies around Intel. Intel being formed around chips. And then after chips, of course, came personal computers. So here you see Apple being formed during this time in Silicon Valley. Each of these creates a successive wave. Internet, of course, in the 1990s with Netscape, with Cisco, Yahoo, the first Silicon Valley internet bubble. And then what some people are calling the current social media wave. Basically from here onwards, companies like, Google really started back here, but Facebook and many other social media companies, which we'll talk about today. We're not going to talk about life sciences, so we're just going to focus on information technologies. But this is a bit of a long-term view. Why are information technologies important? Well, they really drive Silicon Valley. Software, hardware, whether it's chips or computers, today cloud computing, networking, really have been the major driver of innovation in Silicon Valley. And they're important because, especially today, they're becoming increasingly important, especially software, because software is the speed of innovation in software is actually becoming much more rapid than any other sector. If you just look at the mobile apps sector, There's been a lot of innovation, many new companies, mobile apps formed. We'll talk about that later on. But the software sector really is where most of the new companies are formed, where the majority of investment capital is going, but also where the biggest investor returns are being made and the fastest returns. So the information technology sector really generates new waves of capital through investments in successful companies that are sold, and that capital gets reinvested in new generations of companies. So a little bit about my background. I wear several hats. One of the hats I wear is that I teach at Stanford in the engineering school. I have a PhD in mechanical and electrical engineering from Stanford in the product design group. So one of the things that we do at Stanford, which is a little different from many European and Russian universities, is we teach and do research on product design in the engineering school. The design of how to design consumer electronics, automobiles, aircraft, satellites, medical devices, other consumer devices, as well as industry devices. This is one reason why Apple has been so successful with the iPad, with the iPod, the Nano, many other consumer electronics, going back many years, is because product design in Silicon Valley is an extremely important competency. And unfortunately, except for the Nordic countries, parts of Germany, Netherlands, a little bit in the United Kingdom, many parts of Europe, especially Eastern Europe, lack strong product design traditions and competencies in the engineering schools. We'll touch on that a little bit later. So this is the course I teach at Stanford. I lecture on the subject of European entrepreneurship and innovation. We've been doing this for 4 years. We work with several European governments who sponsor the course each year, along with European companies and industry associations. We bring in European entrepreneurs from all across Europe, from Ireland to Russia, from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. We also bring in investors to talk about the European startup scene, the differences between Europe and Silicon Valley around entrepreneurship, differences between the innovation ecosystems. And we also invite Europeans active in Silicon Valley. For example, these two gentlemen are some of the two leading investors in software companies in Silicon Valley. Jeff is French. He has a venture capital firm called SoftTech VC. So he came to Silicon Valley maybe 7-8 years ago as a French guy and established himself, and now he's a very well-respected venture capitalist. Aydin Senkut came to Silicon Valley in the 1990s as a business guy, as a program manager. His first job was with a company called Silicon Graphics, which no longer exists today. After Silicon Graphics, he was hired by Google as one of the very early employees from Google. When Google went public, sold stock, he became quite a wealthy man because he was one of the very early employees. And so he became an investor in new generations of information technology companies. He is a Turkish guy. And we have very large numbers of Europeans from all over Europe in Silicon Valley. Perhaps the countries that are not so well represented would be Eastern Europe, Portugal, for example. Russia's presence is increasing quite quickly in Silicon Valley. But it's a very open community, and we have many people both from Europe, Asia, Latin America coming to Silicon Valley, locating to start companies, to invest in companies, to work in large companies. There are quite a few European large companies, so Orange, Telecom from France, many of the big German companies in information technology, so SAP, Siemens also has a large facility, Nokia, the German car companies, BMW, Daimler, Bosch, also have big research facilities in Silicon Valley. And then a few other major European companies. And Yandex has a research operation in Silicon Valley too. So we look broadly at the differences between Europe and Silicon Valley in research, in universities, in entrepreneurship, in investing, many other areas. Over the past 4 years, where you see a logo that has been a partner of ours, either a government partner, as in the region of Madrid or the Basque region in Spain, or Enterprise Ireland, national government agency of Ireland. More of our partners have come from the Nordic region than other parts of Europe. We've had some industry partners as well. The colored countries indicate where we've had speakers from. Gray means we've had no speakers. So you can see big gaps in Eastern Europe and Portugal in Western Europe. Europe is a lot of territory to cover, and this is a course that's taught over 1 semester. So we have limited slots for speaking sessions. But over 4 years, you can see we've covered quite a bit. Outside of Stanford, I also do a lot of public speaking, such as with you here today, but also several other conferences and events here in Moscow, but at other conferences, and then I also do consulting work, advisory work with European regions, with the European Commission, national governments, angel investor groups, startup companies, corporations. I work across the entire innovation ecosystem. So you can see that while I cover a lot of Europe, there are still major parts of Europe. For example, I really have not been working in France for the past 4 years. And as I said, this is my first time to Russia. On the government scene, I've worked as a FP7 expert evaluator for the European Commission, reviewing research proposals from across Europe. I've spoken at the European Parliament on European Union innovation policy. And in 2010, I was a member of the Prime Minister's Innovation Task Force in Ireland, where we helped to write the new innovation policy for Ireland. And then outside of my current European work, so in earlier days, recent days, and taking off my professor hat, I've worked at several major companies doing research, General Electric and corporate R&D labs, essentially doing business development and strategy for General Electric around hydrogen. I also have done research inside Mercedes, and I was also a researcher at Hewlett-Packard. And then one of the more interesting things I've done is to co-found an angel investor group focused on space and aviation companies. Today, I'm on the advisory board of a very interesting company out of Finland in the area of equity crowdfunding. Is crowdfunding, is that something that's being discussed here in Moscow or Russia? Do you know what crowdfunding is? So there are several types of crowdfunding. I'll just say a few words. Equity crowdfunding is where you're purchasing shares in the company. The general idea is that there are many thousands of startup companies around the globe that are having a difficult time raising capital. So how can we use the power of the internet to reach out to millions of people who might invest very small amounts of money? So instead of big amounts of money, instead of $10,000, $20,000, $50,000, $100,000, what if investors instead could be average normal people who invest maybe $100 or $1,000, $500, something like that, and you divide the equity up in much smaller pieces, but it could potentially allow new startup companies to get access to capital more quickly on a global level and have investors from all around the world investing in interesting new startups. So this is a very new industry. In the United States, President Obama signed new law into act just 1 month ago, which changes U.S. law to allow for an early version of equity crowdfunding under U.S. securities law. So this is still extremely experimental. Here in Europe, the United Kingdom will probably follow quickly with new laws which allow this also to be put in place. But this is something that I think could be of great interest in Russia and Eastern Europe in general for your startup companies. It's not ready today, but it's something you should watch when you study and try and understand what's happening in venture finance in the United States and Europe and around the globe, because this could really become quite new, interesting, and radical shift in funding of startup companies. So what I'm going to focus on now, we're now moving into the section where I'm going to talk about 7 different areas of information technology trends in Silicon Valley. This first section is essentially on social media. I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 new trends in social media we call social curation and enterprise social as well. The big event that I'm sure you've all heard about is the recent sale of Facebook stock on the public stock markets in the United States. We call that an IPO, so initial public offering, where a company's stock is offered on the US stock exchanges. And so this was offered initially on May 21st. This is the chart as Monday, so it's not quite up to date. And so when Facebook first started here at the beginning of the day on Monday, it sold, its initial offering price I think was $38. And the problem is, which valued it at around $100 billion. The problem is that nobody wants to buy Facebook stock at $38. So you can see from day one, essentially a continuing decline in Facebook stock prices, which means that the public and the markets really have not accepted the valuation of $100 billion. They think Facebook is worth something less. And so this is still in very early days for Facebook. Everybody's waiting to see where Facebook is going in terms of its advertising model, in terms of its growth in membership and subscribers. But as of 2 days ago, it had declined to $29. So that's a decrease of $9 from the initial offering price. As of 2 weeks ago, that's a fairly large drop in market valuation for Facebook. And the reason this is important is that Facebook was really setting the bar. It was essentially becoming the standard by which many other new companies in social media were being measured in terms of market value, share price. And so the very high valuation for Facebook was pulling up the valuations for all the other companies in social media. And what happens when the market says Facebook is actually should be at a much lower value? Well, what's happening now is all the other valuations of social media companies in Silicon Valley are being pushed down. So what's happening now is a recalculation, a reassessment of this entire sector, social media. Investors are going back and recalculating term sheets, renegotiating term sheets with a view towards reducing valuations of companies because the Facebook, this has been a big bubble in Silicon Valley, and the problems with the decline of Facebook share price really, we say, popped the bubble, have taken the air out of the bubble, and it's bringing valuations down quite substantially. So this is having a big impact across dozens and dozens of startup companies in Silicon Valley today and around the world in the social media space. Facebook is not the only big player, of course. Anybody here on Google+? Google+ is it's doing fairly well. As of April, it was up to 170 million members. It's still not close to Facebook, but given that Google+ is a bit over a year old, 170 million people is pretty good. And this is something that Google is continuing to play with. They're continuing to integrate many of their different services for Picasa, for photographs, web video, web chat. This is something where Google felt they needed to be strategically to compete with Facebook and some of the other networks. and exactly how they're using this Google Plus network to build Google's value proposition to complement its other online services is not really clear yet. But in the United States, in the tech community, basically the feeling is that if you have to have an online presence, if you're a technical professional, if you're an entrepreneur or investor anywhere in the world, you can't be just on Facebook or LinkedIn. You also need to be on Google Plus. So it's getting a little bit more complicated, and it's getting even more complicated because 1 or 2 weeks ago, Microsoft has also released its own social network called Social, which has not been widely publicized. It's let's see, do these work, Natalia? Yeah, these work. Yeah. So that's the new Microsoft network. I haven't signed up for it yet. I don't really want to because I have lots of social media accounts to manage. But Microsoft, I think, has concluded that for them to continue to compete with Google, with Facebook, with Apple, that they need to bring in their existing user base into a more organized social network as well. So social networks are becoming a very big battleground in the information technology sector for dominance with consumers, but increasingly with companies as well, which we'll see in a few minutes. LinkedIn, as of April, was up to about 160 million. It's doing quite well. It's quite profitable. Considered a very well-run company. No issues with overvaluation of LinkedIn. Much more conservatively run than Facebook. The founder of LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman, is regarded as one of the best entrepreneurs and investors in Silicon Valley. I use LinkedIn very extensively on a daily basis. Earlier this week, my LinkedIn network reached 15,800 people. So I use LinkedIn on a daily basis to connect with everybody I meet here in Moscow. I'm going to Portugal tomorrow. I use LinkedIn to build my personal network, but I also use it to connect your networks here, which in many cases are isolated from the global innovation system. I can come in and bring each of you into our networks in Silicon Valley just by clicking a button. It's a very easy way to connect Lisbon, Tallinn, Estonia, as well as Moscow to some of the core information threads in Northern California. So I also recommend, by the way, this site Social Bakers, for those of you who track where social media are going, different usage patterns from country to country, levels of usage, levels of penetration between Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Google+, YouTube. Social Bakers is a very good site to check out. You can see where Russia stands in comparison to other countries around the world. What's interesting about Social Bakers is that it's based in Prague. This is a Czech company. Okay, so it's a very good example of what a very good European entrepreneur and team can do from Europe. And they've just opened up an office in San Francisco. They're also in London and Munich. So we are seeing some very good startups out of Europe. You're all familiar with Rovio out of Finland, but just one example of the increasing number of good startups we're seeing out of Europe. I particularly like Social Bakers because they're Czech. We don't see very many Central European companies getting visibility and attention like Social Bakers. And of course, Twitter. Twitter really today still has a monopoly. No one's really competing against Twitter. The big issue is monetization. When is Twitter going to really have a substantial revenue stream? Still been experimenting with business models for the past couple of years, but it's on path to profitability and expected to go public probably in the next 2 years, something like that. And then there are a number of other efforts by startups, other organizations to bring social media concepts into established media platforms like television. like video and other places, for example. Any questions about broad social media trends? Okay. So now I'm going to talk about social curation. And I understand this may be a bit of a new concept here. It's relatively new, just 1 or 2 years old in Silicon Valley. Who goes to museums here? Okay, so when you go into a museum, you walk in and there's an exhibit case, right, with a rocket, Yuri Gagarin's capsule, maybe, for example, and a plaque or label that says, this is what this is, right? It says this is what this object is and why it's important. And the curator, so the curator is the person in the museum whose job it is to organize all these exhibits, to take these objects which are from another context and to put them in the current social context, right? To provide some additional text to explain and interpret what these artifacts are. Social curation is essentially a very similar concept but applied to new content online. So Pinterest today is probably the leading social curation website. They were started in May of 2011. They're exclusively focused on photographs, so very high definition still photographs, a bit of video as well. And they've really attracted a lot of attention by fashion magazines, women's magazines, jewelry, companies, businesses that rely on photographs to really communicate a lot of information about their products. This is also partly a reaction to the fact that even today, Facebook really doesn't handle photographs terribly well. I mean, I have hundreds of photographs on Facebook, and it's just difficult for people to sort through all of those. I mean, I love Facebook photograph, but Pinterest is the next generation. And what you can do here is you can set up different boards in your account on Pinterest around different themes, and you can curate those, meaning you add some content, maybe some links, explain what those are, some tagging, and you put them up and they become your feed. So you can feed these out to your friends, for example. And so the growth in Pinterest has been massive over the past several months. I'll show you some data in a minute. But this really is becoming a new paradigm, a new model for social media, very specialized, again, around the concept of sharing content optimized around photographs, high quality photographs. So since May 2011, so these are thousands of visitors. So this is 2 million up to 14 million. So you can see in May 2011, let's see, they started blue. So total unique visitors was 418,000. And this is US unique visitors, so 13, sorry, no, these are the average minutes per visitor, so the gray bars. So you can see the exponential growth. I'll show you some additional data just between May and January. What's most interesting is looking at the average time that users are spending has suddenly jumped up here just between August and September to, in this case, more than 90 minutes, and in last January, more than 90 minutes. So this is an hour and a half per user on average that users are spending on Pinterest. This is a huge amount of time, and statistics like this, so large time, so large average visits time, coupled with very large numbers of people, become a huge magnet for advertising and for building other types of commercial services. And for a website, this is the dream of every website, is to get people to spend hours, day after day, on your website. And what Pinterest figured out is that photographs have much more potential and appeal for attracting people, for keeping people, just looking at different photographs, much more potential than just purely text. Social curation really is the next generation beyond blogging. Blogging really is built around a text-only model or very text-heavy model. The problem with blogging is that it also requires a lot of attention to proper writing, to thinking exactly what you're going to say. Social curation is really intended to be much more quick, where you just write a sentence or two plus a photograph or a link, and it's intended to be a much lighter form of blogging, which we call curation. So the growth of Pinterest has been really astonishing. So this is what we call hockey stick, another word for exponential growth. So we like to joke that this is a particular form of Silicon Valley ice hockey, which Silicon Valley is probably better at than most other parts of the world. I know the Russians are excellent at ice hockey too. But this is very unique kind of ice hockey. And so what's interesting here is that if you look at the number of months it took to achieve 17 million unique monthly visitors, Tumblr took 30 months to reach 17 million people, Twitter 22 months, Facebook 16 months, YouTube 12, Pinterest did this in only 9 months. That's less than 1 year. So how could they do this? Well, the US marketplace is very viral. We're a very early adopter market. People are always looking for something new, better, interesting that comes along. European markets, Asian markets, Latin American markets, when it comes to social media and information technologies, typically are not as quick adopters as the US marketplace is. And so to achieve this in 9 months is really an amazing goal, and of course attracts advertisers, provides a very strong base for future revenue and business model, and a very strong base for attracting investors, both individual investors and corporate investors as well. Excuse me. Tumblr is another leading social curation site, which I point you to. There are several sites out there I'll give you examples of. Again, you can see the stronger emphasis on use of photographs, also video, than traditional blogging sites like WordPress. This compares the growth in traffic from September of last year to February between 3 sites. Flickr, so Flickr is the photo sharing site of Yahoo. There's Tumblr and there's Pinterest. You can see Flickr or Yahoo essentially showing no growth over this period. And then Tumblr showing modest growth. So these are millions of unique visitors going from 5 million up to 25 million. But again, look at Pinterest showing exponential growth over a very short period of time. This is the dream startup company that everybody who's a software entrepreneur in Silicon Valley hopes to create, because this is what allows you to attract the best employees, the best investors. This is what becomes a very exciting story to become part of. And this is what Facebook was like in its early days. Just a bit of comparison about the social curation and other sites against Facebook. So Facebook's up at the very top there. You can see that all these other sites, some of which are the traditional social media like LinkedIn, LinkedIn's, well, let's say I don't have a pointer, but you can see LinkedIn is up here. Pinterest is down here. So Pinterest is still in the noise level compared to Facebook. And if you take that bottom layer and expand it, you can see Twitter here showing good growth. So again, this is 200,000 unique visitors, 200 million unique visitors. Twitter is past that at this point, and Pinterest is just taking off here. A couple of other social curation sites you should be aware of are Jux out of New York City. Again, notice the emphasis on video and photographs as part of telling your story. This site is really aimed at artists, performing artists, journalists, people who really are interested in telling stories about what they do or about the things they make. Flipboard is also an interesting social curation site with a particular angle of helping users, consumers, companies build what they call social magazines, where you can bring in social feeds, your feeds from all your different social media, and essentially organize content around it like an online newspaper or magazine for your own network to look at every day. That's continuously updated. And of course, tablets. The tablet has also helped reinforce this whole trend to social curation. Tablets becoming a major, perhaps the major content platform for books, magazines, newspapers, all this type of content. So next we're going to talk about enterprise social, which essentially means social network, social media applied to business applications, which is becoming quite big in the US. There are two companies I'm going to show you, briefly talk about. First is called Jive, and the other is called Yammer. Yammer essentially brings Twitter, same Twitter functionality, but specifically optimized for companies, for enterprise use. Jive, the goal of Jive is to help companies, small companies, large companies, companies the size of Procter & Gamble that have hundreds of brands, help them organize, manage all their different social media feeds. So if you're a large company, whether you're a Nestle or a Procter & Gamble, where you may have hundreds of different brands, you can't have each person, you can't have each Twitter feed being managed by one person. That's just too expensive to have hundreds of people managing all the Twitter feeds, the Facebook fan pages, et cetera. So the challenge, part of the challenge in enterprises is to manage all these different social feeds at a product level, where you can bring in, you can have the product managers managing the Twitter pages, the Facebook pages, the LinkedIn presence, all the other social media presence at a product management group level, at a business unit level, and at a corporate level. So essentially what they're doing is bringing in, building dashboards aimed at corporations, helping corporations manage effectively all these different social media feeds, put content out in social media, but also measure the impact they're having. So they're building a lot of analytics, real-time analytics here on consumer uptake and impact, numbers of retweets, how many times brand names are mentioned, et cetera, et cetera. So social media in the United States and in some companies in Europe are being deeply integrated into business processes like marketing, sales, customer support, customer relationship management, brand promotion. And then finally, reputation management is becoming a little bit of an issue in Silicon Valley now. Now that so many people have their Facebook, their Twitter, their LinkedIn, their Google+, a few other places, how do you know how much impact you're having online with all the shares, all the information you're putting out, all the things you're sending to your friends? How do you know how much impact you're having, how much of an audience you have compared to other people in your community? So there's a startup called Clout, and the goal of Clout is essentially to give people a single score based on a proprietary algorithm. Excuse me. Where you can integrate your Twitter, your Facebook, Google+, LinkedIn, other feeds. The activity, Clout monitors the activity every time you put some content out. It monitors how many people retweet it. And basically it's trying to assess how much influence you have online, how many people you influence, the trend, are you influencing more people, less people, it's day by day, this day, this week. And so it calculates a cumulative score. And what you can do with Clout, and it's still an experimental website, is you can, based on Clout, get some sense of how much influence and reach your voice has online vis-a-vis other people in your community. In Silicon Valley, against President Obama, against other people who use social media, or against companies, for example. So that's social media. Any questions about what we just covered in social media? Let's see, Natalia, how are we doing on time? Okay, we're okay? So next big trend area is mobile. Mobile's huge. And so we're covering 7 individual trends, but what's really happening is a lot of these trends are really converging and intermingling. You have mobile plus social plus cloud all coming together. And so, of course, mobile is extremely big. This has the fact that Apple and Google came into the mobile industry from completely unrelated industries, from the computing industry 4 years ago, has been hugely disruptive in Europe. It's resulted in major layoffs of thousands of people at Nokia and at other companies in Finland, Denmark, and elsewhere across Scandinavia. It's an example of the power of Silicon Valley to bring innovation in new technologies, in product design, and business models to completely upend industries which really where the industry leaders have become complacent and not really at the forefront of innovation trends. So Instagram is an example of one of the new generation of mobile app companies. This was acquired by Facebook a month ago. Essentially, it's a very simple photographic sharing app. This exploded because it was very well designed, a lot of time, effort spent on making it very clean, effective design so people could take photographs, upload them, share them very easily with a few finger swipes. And back in April, they were bought by Facebook for over $1 billion. $1 billion, so it took less than 2 years to build this company. They sold to Facebook for $1.23 billion. Are those good numbers? 2 years, $1 billion, not bad.
This is really not bad, but actually this question, why Facebook pays this amount for Instagram?
Well, that's...
And it's really interesting because now Facebook invented a new app, Facebook Photos, yes? Facebook Camera, sorry, yes. So I don't see connection here between these 2 events.
Well, the other interesting point here is that, so this is the price that Instagram received a month ago. This is before the Facebook IPO, okay? And they received part of the price for Instagram in Facebook stock. This is not the price they would receive today because of the decrease in valuation of Facebook. They would not even receive close to $1 billion today for Instagram. They would probably receive a few hundreds of millions of dollars. So this was one of the several data points that people pointed to, people looked to say, look at the bubble in Silicon Valley, look at the ridiculous valuations for new companies. Now, part of what happened here was that this deal was personally negotiated by Mark Zuckerberg himself over one weekend. He really wanted the design team, so the programming team. This was a really good set of programmers. These guys, I think, had maybe just 20 or 30 people. I mean, these are very small teams in general. But this was also the last deal he negotiated before Facebook went public. So when you go take a company to the public stock markets, you come under the regulatory framework of the United States government, and you're much more limited in what you could do. So he wanted to move quickly before going public. So he was willing to pay a bit of a higher price. But yes, I mean, Instagram would get nowhere close to this number today. And you're right, it's not clear what Facebook's strategy was, given the release of these new apps. But I show this to you as an example of the power of mobile apps, the ability to build companies, to build product, to build traffic extremely quickly with very small teams for very little capital and to build market value extremely quickly. So this is an estimate of basically the number of apps of iPhone versus Android. iPhone started out way ahead, but Google's catching up quite nicely. We're now at the point where together we're well over 1 million apps. You can see again, very good hockey stick growth. Google knows how to do marketing and develop proper distribution and business models here. So Android is going to be overtaking Apple. You also now have Nokia Windows coming in with their, they have a big push on worldwide to get their apps out. They're very aggressively marketing, looking for developers to build on top of the Nokia Windows platform. And in Finland, Aalto University, which is this new super university in Helsinki, very strong student entrepreneurship cluster group there. They're specifically, so Nokia Windows, specifically providing support, focus to help student entrepreneurs build mobile app companies, also in part because of the success of Angry Birds and Rovio, which is based in Helsinki as well. So this whole feature of app companies, quick growth, quick to fail, low capital requirements, small engineering teams, the ability, if you are lucky but know what you're doing, the ability to grow user base very quickly, to grow market value very quickly. This is also the opportunity for Russia. It's an opportunity which really any country can take care of that has good technical talent and that knows, that understands online markets. We'll talk more about this as well. Moving briefly to tablets. Tablets are also heating up. So this is essentially e-readers versus tablets. Amazon is pushing very aggressively its Kindle. Microsoft has announced that they're coming out with a Windows 7 tablet in September. So now you're going to have a whole new set of tablet manufacturers out of Taiwan and other Asian countries, essentially selling Windows-based tablets. Tablets market really is going to become very flooded later this year. iPad, very well designed. Steve Jobs really is quite unique because he spent a lot of time thinking about user interface design and the entire look, feel, and functionality of every product that Apple designed. And that's in part because of this strong Silicon Valley product design competency base at Stanford, other organizations, and belief and understanding that design can be a very strong competitive advantage both for a company but also for countries. Google is also planning on bringing out its own tablet as well. And then, of course, Amazon is continuing to push Kindle as e-reader. And how Amazon is going to withstand all these other tablets and whether it's going to be able to maintain a separate niche for e-readers just around books, no one's really quite sure yet how that's going to play out. The point here, though, is that in the last 4 years, in the US only, the apps economy, and here I'm referring to software, so app software jobs, okay? New startups or new jobs at established companies who hire programmers or shift programmers to programming for mobile apps has created almost 500,000 new jobs in the United States in 4 years, okay? This is the fastest growing global sector in terms of job creation today and perhaps ever in history, except maybe during war times. And these are the numbers which many governments are looking to. So the UK government is specifically looking to using mobile apps aimed at healthcare applications to help improve, bring new innovation to the British healthcare industry. I'm doing work in Latin America, and we're basically utilizing mobile apps also as a way to jumpstart certain Latin American countries, bring them into the innovation sector very quickly, low cost, low risk, by training them around mobile apps programming, design, and entrepreneurship. So the opportunity for Russia, I think, is also the same here as well. So we've talked about mobile, we've talked about social. Cloud computing is also massive, huge. It's continuing to attract a lot of venture capital investment, both in hardware and in software. All the major companies, so some of the leading startups you may have heard about, which are already quite mature, not yet public, include Dropbox, which has raised several $100 million in Silicon Valley over the past few years, Box.net. That's compatible with many other platforms. But you also have the major IT companies now moving into the cloud quite aggressively as well. Microsoft Office, SAP out of Germany, Oracle, Cisco. Google and Facebook have spent the last 3, 4, 5 years building an extensive global network of data centers to support, basically put many of their services into the cloud. This is a data center that Google established in Finland, outside of Helsinki 2 years ago. They converted it into a large data center to serve the Eastern European, Russian, and Nordic market. And the reason they took an old paper plant was because it's right next to a large river, and they can use the river water to cool the data center, to cool the computers. These are very power-intensive, very hot computers which run. And then there are a few startup companies around cloud aiming at specific niches, customer niches, markets. One company that is bringing new cloud computing infrastructure is called Nebula. The CEO of Nebula, he's a young guy, Chris Kemp. He used to be the chief technology officer for NASA Ames. So NASA Ames is the NASA Research Center in Silicon Valley. And what he's doing is bringing open source software and hardware approaches to cloud computing infrastructure. And basically he's taking specialized hardware designs, open source software architectures, putting them in a box and selling these to companies, other organizations, so you can build your own data centers, your own private proprietary cloud for much lower cost than, so order of magnitude lower cost than up to now. So again, cloud plus mobile is changing the entire landscape of computing, not just in Silicon Valley, around the world. The cost of computing is coming way down. The amount of capital you need to fund a new company has come way down. The amount of time you can develop an application and go global with it has dropped dramatically in the last year and a half because of these developments. So this is where the sweet spot is. This is the opportunity for Russian entrepreneurs as well. So big data and web analytics really go together. When you have millions of customers using apps on mobile platforms, as a mobile apps provider or cloud provider, you're also collecting potentially terabytes of data a year, massive amounts of data on consumer purchasing decisions, what pages consumers are visiting. And so the goal of web analytics is to take these massive data sets and to predict future consumer behavior, predict what customers want to buy before they know they want to buy it. So the reason here is, and again, the reason is to maximize revenues, to drive additional sales. So this whole area of web analytics, big data, is getting a lot of attention, very new generation, a new cluster group of web analytics startups companies are being created in the United States, in Europe as well. I think this is another opportunity for Russian startups, given Russia's strengths in computing and statistics, in artificial intelligence. Web analytics could be a very good area for Russian companies to tackle as well. Both in general sense, but also focused on specific user bases, for example. And one example of how analytics is getting increasing attention in Western Europe. This is a German conference. Okay, and for those of you who are interested in following analytics, this is a large community, online community called Analytic Bridge. There's no cost to register. You can see they talk about all sorts of specific analytics platforms, analytic algorithms, data science, conferences, jobs. This is a very good place to go sign up and find out what's happening globally in the analytics, data analytics, web analytics scene. So now, up to now, we've talked about 5 areas which are really global, but being driven out of Silicon Valley. The next 2 areas, edutech and digital healthcare, are really much more focused on Silicon Valley and the US for some important reasons. This first one is educational technologies, or what we call edutech, and the second one is what we call digital healthcare. Last fall, the Stanford School of Engineering made available for the first time its top artificial intelligence course, which was led by a colleague of mine, Sebastian Troon and Peter Norvig, who are 2 of the top artificial intelligence scientists in Silicon Valley. And they essentially said, why don't we put all the lectures real time online for anyone literally in the world to sign up for at no cost. So students from Africa, professors from Malaysia, anywhere around the world. About 20,000 people completed the course. They completed the final examination, received a letter from the professor, so no formal Stanford certificate, but it showed that this can work if you design the technologies properly and in a way which allow the, essentially allow the, I mean, the problem here, the difficulty, the challenge is scalability. You have to design the information systems so that a professor can still handle 100,000 students the way a professor normally might handle 100 students. And the way they did that is they automated as much as possible the examinations through checkboxes, for example. Problem sessions, homework sessions, they automated as much as possible as well. If this required 200 people at Stanford to manage, this would not work. So here we were talking about a team of 2 professors plus 3 or 4 assistants, maximum, all with the use of information technologies. So this got a lot of attention. There are other initiatives around the United States. There's a growing feeling in the US that given that the world is facing many important challenges, such as climate change, that countries, regions like Africa are at risk of falling even further behind. There's a growing sense that universities in the United States and perhaps elsewhere around the world need to do a better job of sharing the advanced knowledge and research that's being developed at those universities for the benefit of people and organizations and countries outside of California and Stanford. So one result of that course was the creation of a new company called Udacity, which was essentially was formed by Professor Sebastian Troon, who was that guy, the German guy. So Sebastian's a German guy, Peter's American. We have lots of European professors at Stanford, some Russian professors too. So Sebastian started his own company specifically aimed at building platforms to help get education, higher level advanced education around the world. He's still not sure, he doesn't know what the business model is. These are all provided at no cost. So this is a startup company like many others, where there's a understanding of a big market, a problem, an early product, an early service design, but it's not clear what the business model looks like. That's the same problem that Twitter's been trying to solve. A big market, a need, user base, but not clear what the user model is. Well, very similar here. And then a second company also been formed out of Stanford by 2 different professors called Coursera. This is really being done more inside Stanford in cooperation with Stanford and other universities, where these universities are using these technologies, these IT platforms to deliver this course content. So these are just 2 companies I've shown you. There are many, many others in the educational technology area that are receiving private angel and venture capital investment. There's a strong sense of frustration today and questioning in the United States about whether current models for schools, whether it's secondary schools or universities, we're having lots of discussions about whether those models still make sense in the United States anymore, because they're becoming very expensive, they're very slow to change, they're very bureaucratic. In many cases, the secondary schools in the United States do not provide very good education, far behind the secondary schools in many European countries. I'm sure we have many secondary schools in the United States that are far below the level of the best Russian secondary schools. So this is a big problem for the United States. And this is where Silicon Valley and other parts of the technology community are beginning to experiment to see how can we do education differently. So the last sector I'm going to cover is digital healthcare. And we also have very big problems in our national healthcare system. We have a mix of private and public. It's extremely expensive. We have millions of people in the United States who are not whose basic medical needs are not covered, who do not have health insurance, who cannot afford medical care. I mean, tens of millions. It's really bad. And so it's also a sector which has traditionally has not been very friendly to innovation. It's been very conservative, slow to change. It's very complex because you have the hospitals, you have the insurance companies, you have doctors, and it's a big mess. So we're also beginning to think, what can we do with technology? How can we design things differently? How can we bring more innovation into getting patients access to healthcare, helping doctors manage patients better, helping hospitals manage their services better, using advanced healthcare, advanced information technology. So kind of the big vision is, that all the data is going to be in the cloud. In data warehouses, databases. This means patient data, doctor data, so X-ray images, other imagery, laboratory results from laboratory tests, hospital records, employee records for managing hospitals, insurance data, so healthcare cost information, for example. Generally, it's all, the idea is that it all should be in the cloud, and it should somehow, and there are lots of legal issues here, privacy issues, it should somehow be available by mobile devices, by tablets, to the patient, to the doctors, to the hospitals, to the ambulances, to all the different players in the US and global healthcare system. So that's kind of the dream. That's the kind of general idea that we think that we could bring from the technology sector into healthcare. That's a very big vision. The tablet is also really beginning to help doctors, hospitals, many other organizations rethink, wow, we could replace all of our paper with tablets, for example. I was in Colombia, South America a month ago, visiting public hospitals there, where you could go into, I went into several hospitals with very large archive rooms, and I saw thousands of patient records, paper folders, just stacked up. Nobody knew where a particular patient's file was. They didn't have the information technology systems or staff or funding to digitize any of this information. This is happening all over Colombia and Latin America. They're just overwhelmed by paper. This is a challenge in many, many countries, including today the United States as well. So tablets are also pushing institutions to rethink how they can put everything, take as much away from paper as possible. I won't go into details of specific healthcare startups. This is one healthcare, digital healthcare incubator in Silicon Valley that was established recently called Rock Health. You can see that they're doing a health innovation summit in August in San Francisco. And so they're incubating digital healthcare companies in many areas. So companies developing new medical devices that connect to your iPhone or tablet that help you monitor blood pressure, heart rate, for example, telemedicine, technologies that help doctors connect with patients from far away, or help hospitals, doctors monitor elderly people. We call that elder care, elder medicine. Help monitor people's health in homes, for example. Many, many areas where information technologies could be used to provide better care and reduce costs as well. So this is a huge area. I could give you an entire day's presentation just on digital healthcare, but this is getting increasing attention, investment in Silicon Valley as well. And so the last 2 points are that there is a very large gap between what is happening in Europe and the United States in these 2 areas: education, edutech, and digital healthcare. We do not see comparable rates of new startup formation in Europe. What do I mean by that? We're seeing many new startups being created in the United States around educational technologies and digital healthcare. We're seeing very few new startups, relatively speaking, in Europe in these 2 areas being created. I'm still trying to understand why that's the case. So security, just quickly, another area where Russia is very strong, traditional technologies. Just a couple of examples of 2 companies, Data Castle and Mobilisafe, both startups aimed at helping enterprises manage data on mobile devices, tablets, cell phones in a safe manner. I think one of the questions I'm asking, so I believe Europe, broadly speaking, with some exceptions, has not really adopted software as an engine of growth in the same way that the United States has, and that we see many large European companies, medium-sized European companies, are not rapid adopters of new software technologies such as social media. They continually lag behind US companies. And so here is where I look to European business schools. And many of the European business schools I visited, in my opinion, do not do a very good job of teaching students the importance of information technology and how to integrate information technology strategy with corporate strategy. That's a big problem in many European companies that I've seen. And finally, I understand that there are very deep roots in Europe and Russia around, and traditions around how universities are organized and the mission and goal and rationale for universities. But if you look at the experience of Finland and other countries, the United States, it's my opinion that many European countries need to rethink the model for the public university today. Finland is a very good example of a country that in 2009 completely reorganized their university system. And I think there are a lot of very good lessons that Russia could take from looking at the Finnish example. So I'm trying to be positive. So the countries and places I think Russia could benefit from in terms of cooperation in Europe, definitely Finland. The Estonians are doing interesting things. Some of the other Nordic countries, Swedish universities are very good. Swedish startups tend to be very good. Spotify is out of Sweden, for example. Berlin is also now a very active startup sector, startup hub. Lots of interesting startups and accelerators, incubators going on there. London is also a very good place to be connected into from typically some of the best, smartest investors in Europe, but also British universities are moving quickly to reform their institutional models. And so we're going to be seeing increasing numbers of startups coming out of the UK. And in ICT, Dublin, Ireland is also a place looking at, the Irish are very well connected into the United States, but also almost all the big US ICT companies have major European operations located in Ireland. So Ireland can be a very good place for Russian companies to consider as well. The places that I do not think that Russian companies or Russia can learn much from are essentially most of the other European areas that are having difficulties and that have not really looked at reforming their institutions or universities, so Mediterranean region companies, many other Eastern European countries. So my main caution for Russia is be careful who you cooperate with in Europe. Europe has many ideas, but in my view, a lot of the ideas coming out of Brussels and other national capitals will not really serve Russia well in the long term because they do not really represent rethinking of the basic models underlying institutions in Europe. So thank you very much. So I'll take your questions now.